There is a city sitting in the middle of Iraq that changed the entire course of human civilization. It invented writing. It invented law. It invented the concept of a city itself. For 2,000 years, it was the largest urban center on Earth, a place so cosmopolitan, so wealthy, so architecturally staggering that visitors from Greece and Egypt wrote home describing something that sounded like a fever dream. And right now, today, in the year 2026, almost none of it has been excavated. Almost none of it has been properly studied. And the parts that were excavated in the 19th and early 20th centuries were done so badly, so hastily, so destructively, that archaeologists today describe the early digs at Babylon as one of the greatest archaeological catastrophes in human history. That is not hyperbole. That is the professional consensus. Babylon sits about 85 kilometers south of Baghdad, near the modern town of Al-Hilla, in the Babel Governorate of Iraq. The site covers roughly 10 square kilometers of visible surface area, but the underground extent is significantly larger and has never been fully mapped. What we know about ancient Babylon comes from a combination of cuneiform texts, Greek and Roman accounts, and the results of excavations conducted primarily by Robert Koldewey of the Deutsche Orient-Gesellschaft between 1899 and 1917. Koldewey's excavation was the most systematic attempt ever made to understand the physical city. And even Koldewey, working for 18 consecutive years with a permanent team of up to 250 workers, estimated that he had uncovered less than a quarter of the total site. Less than a quarter. In 18 years, with 250 workers. What he found in that quarter was already extraordinary enough to reshape understanding of the ancient world. The Ishtar Gate, reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin from fragments Koldewey shipped back to Germany, its glazed blue bricks and golden dragons and bulls visible today to anyone who buys a museum ticket, was only the 8th gate of the inner city. Not the main gate, the 8th. There were at least 8 more gates of comparable or greater significance that Koldewey either partially excavated or never reached at all. 8 gates. And the one everyone knows about was number 8, the processional way, the ceremonial road leading from the Ishtar Gate through the heart of the city, was lined with glazed brick reliefs of lions on both sides for a distance of over 180 meters. Koldewey uncovered significant portions of it. What he did not uncover was where it led underground. Because the processional way at Babylon did not just run along the surface, it ran over structures. And those structures, the foundations, the subterranean chambers, the drainage systems, the storage vaults beneath the ceremonial boulevard of the greatest city in the ancient world, are almost entirely unexcavated. Below the most famous street in ancient history, unexcavated. Now here is where it gets genuinely strange. Because the reason Babylon remains unexcavated is not simply war, not simply politics, not simply the difficulty of working in Iraq. Those are real factors, but they are not the complete explanation. The complete explanation involves a sequence of decisions, accidents, and deliberate choices made by governments, institutions, and individuals over the course of 150 years. A sequence that looks, when you lay it out in order, less like bad luck and more like a pattern. Robert Koldewey left Babylon in 1917 because the First World War made it impossible to continue. He took his records, his notebooks, his drawings, and the most portable of his finds, and left. The site was not handed to a successor organization. It was not formally closed in a way that protected what had been uncovered. It was simply abandoned. Koldewey died in Berlin in 1925, with his final comprehensive publication of the Babylon excavations unfinished. His colleague Walter André completed a partial version, Die Festungswerke von Assur, published through the Deutsche Orient-Gesellschaft in 1913, gives some indication of the documentation standards, but the comprehensive Babylon report was never fully realized. The documentation of what Koldewey found? Partial. The site itself? Abandoned and unprotected for decades. What happened to Babylon between 1917 and the 1950s is one of the least discussed chapters in the history of archaeology. Local populations removed bricks. Ancient Babylonian baked bricks are extraordinary building material, durable and precisely made, and they were used in the construction of buildings throughout the Al-Hilla region for decades. This is documented by Taha Bakir, the Iraqi archaeologist who became director of the Iraq Museum and who conducted surveys of the Babylon site in the 1940s. His assessments, published in the journal Sumer, Volume 3, 1947, describe the scale of brick removal as extensive and the damage as irreversible in multiple areas. Irreversible damage. Documented in 1947, before the major modern disruptions even began. The Iraqi Department of Antiquities began limited work at Babylon in the 1950s under Bakir's direction, and German teams returned in the 1960s and 70s. The Deutsche Orient-Gesellschaft resumed excavations under Hans-Jörg Nissen and later Rainer Michael Bohmer, whose work on the topography of the site produced the most detailed surface maps available, published through the Deutsches Archäologisches Institut in 1990 as Uruk Kleinfunde. Bohmer's work revealed that the surviving surface features of Babylon were significantly more complex than Koldeve's maps had suggested, that there were entire districts of the ancient city that had never been touched by any excavation team. Entire districts. 120 years after the first modern excavation began. Then came Saddam Hussein. What Saddam did to Babylon between 1983 and 2003 is described by every archaeologist who has studied it as a second catastrophe comparable to the first. Saddam decided to rebuild Babylon. Not conserve it, not study it, rebuild it. He constructed a modern palace on an artificial hill directly over unexcavated ancient remains. He built replicas of ancient structures using modern bricks stamped with his own name. Just as Nebuchadnezzar II had stamped his name on the bricks of the original city, Saddam had his contractors stamp Saddam Hussein, son of Nebuchadnezzar, on the new bricks laid over the ancient foundations. His name on bricks, on top of the ruins, over the unexcavated remains of the greatest city of the ancient world. The archaeological damage this caused is documented in a UNESCO assessment conducted in 2009 by the World Monuments Fund in partnership with the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage. The report, authored by John Curtis of the British Museum and available through the World Monuments Fund archive, catalogues the construction of modern roads directly over ancient remains, the leveling of unexcavated mounds, the digging of foundation trenches through layers that had never been studied, and the permanent destruction of contextual stratigraphy across multiple areas of the site. Permanent destruction, formally catalogued by the British Museum's own senior curator. And then came the American military. After the 2003 invasion, the United States military established a base at Babylon, Camp Alpha, directly on and within the ancient site. The base operated from April 2003 to December 2004. What happened to the site during those 20 months is documented in the Curtis Report and in subsequent assessments by the Archaeologists for the Protection of Iraqi Cultural Heritage, a group coordinated through the World Archaeological Congress. Military vehicles drove across unexcavated areas. Helicopters landed on surfaces containing ancient remains. Fuel bladders were placed on the site. Sandbags were filled with archaeological soil. A parking lot was flattened across previously undisturbed ground, and most significantly, trenches were dug for military infrastructure through areas that had never been excavated, permanently destroying stratigraphic sequences that could have dated and identified what was below. Trenches dug through unexcavated ancient Babylon for a parking lot. The Curtis Report estimates that areas of the site covering approximately 2,500 square meters were significantly damaged during the military occupation. This sounds like a small number until you understand that 2,500 square meters of undisturbed ancient Babylon represents an irreplaceable archive of information about one of the most consequential cities in human history. Information that was intact for 2,500 years and was destroyed in 20 months. Intact for 2,500 years, destroyed in 20 months. But here is what almost nobody talks about. Here is the part that gets quietly left out of the standard account of why Babylon cannot be studied. The areas of Babylon that were not damaged by Koldewey's extraction, not damaged by brick removal, not damaged by Saddam's construction, and not damaged by the American military occupation. Those areas still exist. They are intact. They are underground. And they have been assessed by ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry surveys as containing significant subsurface features. The most comprehensive geophysical survey of Babylon conducted in the modern era was carried out by a team from the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich under Stefan Igel and published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2011. Igel's team used electrical resistivity tomography and ground-penetrating radar across multiple sectors of the site. Their results showed subsurface anomalies at depths ranging from 2 to 15 meters across areas that had never been excavated. Anomalies consistent with large-scale architectural remains, with vaulted structures, with what the report describes as significant buried features of indeterminate function. Significant buried features of indeterminate function. Directly under a site nobody is allowed to systematically excavate. What specifically are those features? The honest answer is that nobody knows, because nobody has been allowed to find out. The political situation in Iraq has made sustained, systematic archaeological work at Babylon essentially impossible since 2003. The Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, reconstituted after significant losses during the post-invasion period, when the Iraq Museum was looted and an estimated 15,000 objects were stolen, according to Donnie George, the museum's director at the time, speaking to The Guardian in 2003, has authorized limited work at the site. But limited work at a 10-square-kilometer site with unknown depths of buried material is not the same as systematic excavation. Limited work. At a site that invented civilization, here is what the cuneiform texts say is buried at Babylon. Not as mythology, as administrative record. The Temple of Marduk, Esagila, meaning House of the Raised Head, was described in detail in a Babylonian text known as the Esagila Tablet, held in the British Museum as tablet number BM34, published in a critical edition by Andrew George of the University of London in his book Babylonian Topographical Texts through Peters Publishers in 1992. The Esagila Tablet gives precise measurements of the temple complex, the heights of the towers, the dimensions of the inner sanctuaries, the depths of the foundations. The depths of the foundations, precisely recorded by the people who built them. According to the Esagila Tablet, as analyzed by George, the innermost sanctuary of Marduk, the room that contained the gold statue of the god, the room that only the high priest could enter, the room that was the literal center of Babylonian cosmological and political authority for over 1,000 years, had foundations extending to a depth described in the text as reaching the underground water table. The Apisu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that in Babylonian cosmology lay beneath the foundations of every temple. The point where the built world met the primordial. The innermost sanctuary built down to the underground water table. Its foundations have never been excavated. Herodotus visited Babylon in approximately 450 BCE, roughly a century after the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, who built the city in its final great form. And his account in the Histories, Book 1, sections 178 through 183, describes what he personally observed. He describes a tower of 8 stages, almost certainly the ziggurat Etemenanki, the real-world structure that became the basis for the Tower of Babel narrative, and says at its summit was a great temple with a golden couch and table. He also describes underground passages connecting the 2 parts of the city on either side of the Euphrates. Passages with bronze gates, passages wide enough for a cart. Underground passages with bronze gates wide enough for a cart, connecting the 2 halves of the largest city on earth. Herodotus says he was told about them by the priests of Babylon. He did not enter them himself. He did not enter them himself. Koldewey found evidence of the Euphrates tunnel system during his excavations. His field notebooks, analyzed by Joachim Marzahn of the Vorder Asiatisches Museum in Berlin, in a paper published in Mitteilungen der Deutschen Orientgesellschaft in 1998, described the discovery of what appear to be the entrance structures of a subterranean passage system on the eastern bank of the Euphrates at Babylon. Koldewey could not follow these structures because the water table made excavation impossible with the technology of his era. Water table too high for 1900 technology. That was the barrier then. Ground-penetrating radar does not have that problem. Electrical resistivity tomography does not have that problem. Magnetometry does not have that problem. Modern geophysical survey technology can map what is below the water table without digging a single trench. And the Eigel survey of 2011 did detect anomalies in the areas corresponding to where Koldewey's notebooks placed the passage system entrances. Anomalies that Eigel's report describes as potentially consistent with large linear subsurface voids. Large linear subsurface voids. In the location where Herodotus described underground passages, in the location where Koldewey's notebooks placed entrance structures, mapped by ground-penetrating radar in 2011, not excavated. The question of why they have not been excavated has a series of official answers: political instability, security concerns, funding limitations, the complexity of working in a water table-affected environment, the priority of conservation over excavation at a damaged site. All of these are real. All of them are legitimate factors. None of them fully explains why the most important archaeological site on Earth, the city that created writing, law, mathematics, astronomy, and the concept of urban life, has been less systematically studied in the modern era than Roman villas in the English countryside. Less systematically studied than Roman villas in England, the city that invented writing. There is one more element that almost never appears in the standard discussion of Babylon's inaccessibility. It involves something found not at the site itself, but in the archives of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, or rather, something that was in those archives and is no longer there. Among the objects looted from the Iraq Museum during the chaos of April 2003 were a significant number of cuneiform tablets from the museum's collection of unpublished documents. Donnie George's estimate of 15,000 stolen objects has been refined by subsequent analysis. The Illicit Antiquities Research Center at Cambridge, in a report by Neil Brodie published in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal in 2011, estimated that approximately 10 to 13,000 objects remain unaccounted for from the museum's collection. Among these are tablets that were in the process of being catalogued but had not yet been published. Tablets whose contents were known to the museum staff but unknown to the broader scholarly community. Tablets whose contents were known to museum staff but unknown to scholarship. Stolen in 2003, not recovered. What were those tablets about? The honest answer is that nobody outside the museum staff who were cataloging them knows. The partial catalog records that survived suggest they included administrative and religious texts from the Babylonian and Neo-Babylonian periods, the periods of Nebuchadnezzar and his predecessors, the periods when Esagila was at the height of its function, the periods when the underground systems described by Herodotus were actively used. Administrative texts from the period when the underground systems were actively used. Missing. This is not a conspiracy theory. The theft of the Iraq Museum is one of the best documented cultural catastrophes of the 21st century. The tablets were real. They were being catalogued. They were taken. Some have appeared on the antiquities market. In 2017, the Green family, owners of Hobby Lobby, paid $1.6 million for cuneiform tablets that the U.S. Department of Justice subsequently determined were smuggled out of Iraq after 2003, as documented in the federal forfeiture complaint filed in the Eastern District of New York. The tablets the Green family bought were identified. They are now in public collections. The tablets that have not appeared on the market, the ones still missing, remain unknown. Unknown content, unknown location, from the city that invented writing. The geophysical anomalies are real. The cuneiform descriptions of underground architecture are real. Herodotus's account of passages with bronze gates is 2,500 years old and was written by a man who had personally visited the city. Koldewey's field notebooks describing entrance structures are in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin and can be read by anyone with the right credentials. The Eagle Survey is published in a peer-reviewed journal. The missing tablets are documented in federal court records. All of these things are simultaneously true, and Babylon sits in the Babil Governorate of Iraq, 85 kilometers south of Baghdad, with its underground intact and its secrets below the water table, surrounded by security concerns and political complexity and funding shortfalls, and the accumulated damage of 150 years of the wrong kind of attention. The Ishtar Gate is in Berlin. The cuneiform texts are in London and Paris and Philadelphia. The field notebooks are in Berlin. The missing tablets are somewhere unknown. And the city itself, the actual physical city, the underground city, the city with the bronze-gated passages and the foundations going down to the APSU, is sitting in the Iraqi desert, waiting for a window of stability that has not yet arrived. A window that has not arrived in 150 years of trying. The anomalies detected by the Eagle Survey have not been followed up with excavation. They have been noted, published, filed, and left. Somewhere below the surface of those 10 square kilometers is whatever Herodotus did not enter. Whatever the Esagila tablet measured in precise cubits. Whatever Koldewey's field notebooks placed at the water table. Whatever administrative records described in tablets that are now either in an unknown private collection or sitting in a box in a storage facility in a country that doesn't know what it has. The city that invented writing has not finished telling its story. It is just that no one has been able to get in to read the next chapter. Not yet. Now about what was actually inside Esagila. Because the cuneiform record is specific enough that we are not dealing in vague, mystical generalities. We are dealing in measurements, in inventories, in administrative records of a bureaucracy that ran one of the most sophisticated religious and economic institutions in the ancient world for over 1,000 years. And those records describe something that modern archaeology has never physically confirmed because modern archaeology has never gotten below the surface. The Esagila tablet, British Museum BM34, the same tablet that Andrew George analyzed in his 1992 publication, gives the dimensions of the main temple complex with a precision that startled scholars when it was first properly translated. The outer courtyard measured 340 cubits by 230 cubits. The inner courtyard measured 140 cubits by 130 cubits. The innermost sanctuary, the Ubashukina, the chamber where the fate of the world was decided each new year in the Babylonian theological imagination, measured 20 cubits by 20 cubits. Every wall thickness is given. Every doorway width is given. Every height is given. Every measurement given. For a room that has never been physically located by modern excavation. There is a reason archaeologists find this document extraordinary and slightly unnerving at the same time. The Esagila tablet reads not like mythology, but like a contractor's specification. It reads like someone who was responsible for the building wanted a permanent record of exactly what had been built and exactly where everything was. The precision is the precision of someone who needed this information to be usable. Not inspirational, not symbolic, not theological. Usable. As in, if you need to find something, here are the measurements that will tell you where to dig. As in, if you need to find something. The inventory texts from Esagila are even more specific. A series of Neo-Babylonian administrative tablets, many of them held in the British Museum in the collection designated as the Sipar Archive, analyzed by Michael Jersa of the University of Vienna in his comprehensive study Aspects of the Economic History of Babylonia in the First Millennium BC, published through Ugarit Verlag in Münster in 2010, describe the contents of Esagila in considerable detail. Gold vessels, silver vessels, lapis lazuli inlays, cedar beams imported from Lebanon. The statue of Marduk itself, described as made of pure gold in amounts that ancient sources consistently report as staggering. The amount of gold described in the Esagila temple inventories has been a subject of scholarly debate since the texts were first translated. Herodotus says he was told the statue alone weighed 800 talents of gold. A Babylonian talent is approximately 30 kilograms. 800 Babylonian talents of gold is approximately 24,000 kilograms of gold. At today's prices, that is approximately 1.8 billion US dollars in the statue alone, not counting the furniture, the vessels, the inlays, the secondary cult objects described in the inventory texts. $1.8 billion in a single statue, in a room whose physical location has never been confirmed by excavation. Where did it go? This is the question that every scholar of ancient Babylon eventually confronts, and the answer is genuinely unknown in a way that is different from the standard scholarly unknown. This is not, we haven't studied it enough. This is, we have studied it extensively, and the trail goes cold in a specific and deliberate way. The last unambiguous reference to the golden statue of Marduk in the historical record comes from the reign of Nabonidus, the same Nabonidus who spent 10 years in Tima looking for ancient signs, about whom there is a separate series, and whose story must not be mixed into this one. The statue disappears from the administrative record after the Persian conquest of Babylon by Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE. Cyrus famously restored Babylonian religious practices. His Cyrus cylinder, held in the British Museum, is one of the most celebrated ancient documents in the world, and explicitly describes his respect for Marduk. But after Cyrus, and especially after Xerxes I sacked Babylon in 482 BCE, and according to Arrian's Anabasis, removed the statue of Marduk, the physical object itself vanishes from the record. Vanishes. From the administrative record of the most bureaucratic civilization in the ancient world. Arrian says Xerxes melted it down. This is the standard scholarly conclusion. But Arrian was writing in the 2nd century CE, 600 years after the events he describes. His sources were Alexander's campaign historians, men writing propaganda for a conqueror who had his own reasons for claiming that Xerxes had destroyed the statue. If Xerxes had destroyed the statue, there was nothing to restore, and Alexander could not be criticized for failing to restore it. This is a politically motivated narrative written by people who were not there. Politically motivated narrative written 600 years later. That is what the standard account of the statue's fate rests on. There is an alternative tradition. A cuneiform text in the British Museum collection, designated BM 38514, analyzed by Amelie Kurt of University College London in her paper published in Achaemenid History Volume 3 through the Netherlands Institute for the Near East in Leiden in 1988, describes activity at Esagila during the period after Xerxes that is inconsistent with a completely destroyed and melted cult statue. The text records temple personnel performing rituals that specifically require the physical presence of the deity's statue. If the statue had been melted in 482, this text, dated to approximately 460 BCE, should not describe those rituals as ongoing. Temple personnel performing rituals requiring the statue's physical presence. 22 years after the statue was supposedly melted. Kurt does not draw the conclusion that the statue survived. She notes the inconsistency and flags it as requiring further investigation. That further investigation has not produced a resolution. The text exists. The inconsistency exists. The standard account does not fully account for it. What this means in practical terms is that the physical fate of the most valuable cult object in the ancient world, an object made of gold in quantities sufficient to constitute one of the largest single accumulations of precious metal in human history, is genuinely unknown. Not probably melted, not confirmed destroyed. Unknown. Unknown. The location of approximately 24,000 kilograms of gold from the innermost sanctuary of the greatest temple of the ancient world is unknown. And directly below the site where that sanctuary stood, its foundations, its subterranean vaults, its connection to the water table, is a set of geophysical anomalies that have not been excavated. This is not the only thing the cuneiform record describes as having been placed in the foundations of Babylonian temples. Foundation deposits, temenu in Akkadian, were standard practice in Mesopotamian religious architecture. Every significant temple was built over a deposit placed in the foundations at the time of construction or renovation. These deposits contained documents, written records of who built the structure, when, for what purpose, along with ritual objects, precious materials, and sometimes objects described as having been inherited from much earlier periods. Objects inherited from earlier periods, deliberately buried in temple foundations, accessible only by dismantling the structure above them. The most significant analysis of Babylonian foundation deposits was conducted by Ellis Richard from the University of Pennsylvania. His Foundation Deposits in Ancient Mesopotamia, published through Yale University Press in 1968, remains the standard reference. Ellis documented that major Babylonian temples contained foundation deposits at multiple levels, corresponding to different periods of construction, meaning that a temple rebuilt 10 times over 1,000 years has 10 layers of deliberate deposits, each placed by the builders of that renovation, each containing objects and documents from their period, and sometimes objects described as having come from the previous deposit level. 10 layers of deliberate deposits, each containing documents and objects. At Esagila, which was continuously rebuilt and renovated for over 2,000 years according to the cuneiform record, the potential number of deposit layers is extraordinary. None of them have been excavated at Esagila. Koldewey identified the general location of Esagila during his excavations. His notebooks place it in the southern sector of the inner city near the Euphrates bank. He could not excavate it systematically for 2 reasons. First, the water table in that area was too high for his technology. Second, and this is the part that is not often emphasized, the area was and remains occupied by the modern town of Jumjuma. A living community of several hundred people is built directly over the most significant unexcavated religious complex in human history. A living town on top of it. This is not unusual in the archaeology of the ancient Near East. Many of the most significant sites have modern habitation over them. What is unusual is the specific combination at Babylon of modern habitation, high water table, political instability, previous destructive excavation of surrounding areas, and a cuneiform textual record specific enough to describe exactly what should be below. Exactly what should be below, with measurements, in cubits. The ziggurat Etemenanki, the Tower of Babel structure, presents a different but equally striking problem. Koldewey excavated the ground plan of Etemenanki and confirmed it matched the dimensions given in a Babylonian text known as the Esagila Tablets Companion Document, the AO 6555 in the Louvre collection, published by Franz Heinrich Weissbach in Die Keilenschriften der Achämeniden through Hinrichs Verlag in Leipzig in 1911. The ground plan matched. The foundations were identified, but the foundation pit, the deliberately excavated void at the center of a Mesopotamian ziggurat in which the most significant foundation deposit was placed, was never reached. Never reached. Because the water table. The water table at Babylon is not a natural feature of the landscape in the way it was in antiquity. The modern water table at the site is significantly higher than it was in the Neo-Babylonian period due to changes in irrigation infrastructure over the centuries. This means that the foundation pit of the Tower of Babel, the deliberately dug central void of the most symbolically significant structure in Babylonian religious architecture, is now below the water table, not because the Babylonians built it there, but because the hydrology of the surrounding agricultural landscape changed over 2,000 years. The foundation pit of the Tower of Babel is below water, because of medieval irrigation. This is precisely the kind of detail that sounds like it should have a solution, and does not. Because recovering the contents of a foundation pit that is below the water table in an area with modern habitation above it and political instability around it, and a water table that fluctuates seasonally. That requires sustained, well-funded, technically sophisticated, politically supported archaeological work of a kind that has simply not been possible at Babylon in the modern era. Not possible. At the site that gave civilization writing and law, the texts that describe what was placed in the Etemenanke foundation pit are themselves fragmentary. But they consistently describe the pit as containing objects placed there by Nebuchadnezzar II himself, who rebuilt the ziggurat in approximately 600 BCE in its final and greatest form. Nebuchadnezzar II is the best documented king in the entire Neo-Babylonian period. His building inscriptions are preserved in dozens of exemplars. His administrative records fill entire museum collections. And in those records, he describes placing at the foundation of Etemenanke objects that he describes as having come from earlier periods. Objects he describes finding in the ruins of the previous structure and deliberately reburying at greater depth. Deliberately reburying at greater depth. Whatever was in the previous Etemenanke, placed there by Nebuchadnezzar's predecessors, Nebuchadnezzar found it, documented that he found it, and put it back. Deeper. He put it back deeper. The previous Etemenanke had been built approximately 1,000 years before Nebuchadnezzar, during the Kassite period of Babylonian history, roughly 1400 to 1100 BCE. The Kassite dynasty is one of the least understood major periods in Mesopotamian history, precisely because Kassite period texts are relatively sparse. What they ruled, how they organized the Babylonian religious apparatus, what they placed in their monument foundations, these are questions with partial answers at best. Nebuchadnezzar found something from the Kassite period under the previous Etemenanke, documented that he found it, put it back deeper, and built the most massive ziggurat in history on top of it. With a foundation pit now below the water table. Now. Today. The final piece of this picture involves a building that most people have never heard of, but which may be the most significant unexcavated structure at the entire Babylon site. It is called the Egidrikalama, the house which binds together the land, and it is referenced in multiple Babylonian administrative texts as a structure within the Esagila complex that contained what the texts describe as the Kispu archive. The Kispu was the Babylonian ritual of feeding the dead, a practice by which the names of ancestors were recited and offerings were made. In the royal version of this ritual, the names of every king of Babylon going back to the earliest rulers were recited in sequence. Every name, in order. Going back to a point in Babylonian historical consciousness that the texts describe as before the flood. Before the flood. The KISPU archive was the physical record maintaining those sequences of names. Without the archive, the ritual could not be performed correctly. The names would be lost, the sequence broken, the connection to the ancestral line severed. Maintaining the KISPU archive was one of the most solemn responsibilities of the Babylonian royal administration. It was not a symbolic responsibility. It was an administrative function with dedicated personnel, dedicated storage, and dedicated funding. Irving Finkel of the British Museum, his The Ark Before Noah, published through Hodder and Stoughton in 2014, discusses the KISPU in the context of Babylonian attitudes toward death and memory, has noted in lectures at the British Museum that the physical KISPU archive at Babylon was specifically associated with the Egidrikalama building, and that this building's precise location within the Esagila complex has never been confirmed by excavation. Never confirmed. The physical location of the archive of every king of Babylon. Unknown. What would the Kispu archive contain? Based on the administrative texts describing its function, clay tablets. Thousands of them. Systematically organized, systematically maintained, updated at regular intervals over the entire span of the Neo-Babylonian period. A continuous sequence of royal names and dates and records going back to the beginning of Babylonian history as the Babylonians themselves understood it. The Babylonians had an internal history of their civilization that extended back further than any modern scholarly chronology has been able to confirm. The Sumerian King List, a document preserved in multiple copies across several museums, names kings going back to a period before the flood, with reigns measured in tens of thousands of years. The scholarly consensus is that these pre-flood reigns are mythological. But the post-flood sections of the King List have been cross-referenced against independent documents, with results that have repeatedly surprised scholars. Names that appeared to be legendary have been confirmed by archaeological finds as historical. The boundary between mythology and history in the Babylonian record keeps moving backward as more material is found. The boundary keeps moving backward. The KISPU archive would represent the Babylonian royal institution's own internal version of that historical record. Not the formal public document of the King List, but the working administrative record used in actual ritual. If it survived, if it was placed in the Igidra Kalama building, which was placed within the Isagila complex, which is sitting under the modern town of Jumjuma, above a water table that has risen over 2,000 years, then it is there. Intact or damaged in ways we cannot predict without examining it. Containing whatever the Babylonian royal administration considered its unbroken connection to its own origins. Intact or damaged. Containing their unbroken connection to their origins. The geophysical survey by Eigel's team in 2011 covered the areas of the site accessible for survey. The areas under modern habitation were not surveyed. The areas near the Euphrates bank where the water table is highest were not surveyed. The core of the ancient city, the Esagila complex with its companion buildings, its underground connections, its foundation pits, its archive buildings, remains geophysically unmapped. The core of the ancient city, unmapped. There is a specific irony in all of this that the situation itself generates. Babylon is the city that invented systematic record-keeping, the city that first understood that if you write something down in durable material and store it carefully, it will survive to inform people who come later. The city that gave humanity the concept of the archive, the organized, maintained, deliberately preserved collection of information. And the archive of Babylon itself, the physical record of its own existence, its own measurements, its own inventory of what it contained, is sitting under a small Iraqi town above a medieval water table in a geopolitically complex region that has not seen sustained peace in the lifetime of anyone currently working in Near Eastern archaeology. The city that invented the archive, its own archive, inaccessible. What is down there is not entirely unknown. The cuneiform record is specific enough that educated estimates are possible. Foundation deposits at multiple levels under Esagila and Etemenanke. The Kispu archive in the Igidra Kalama building. The remains of the tunnel system described by Herodotus with its bronze gates. The structural foundations of the innermost sanctuary with its measurements in the Esagila tablet. Whatever Nebuchadnezzar reburied deeper from the Kassite period previous structure. And the geophysical anomalies, the large linear subsurface voids, the significant buried features of indeterminate function that the Eagle survey detected in 2011 and that nobody has followed up on in 15 years. 15 years since those anomalies were detected and published. Nothing. The window has not opened. The water table has not dropped. The political situation has not stabilized sufficiently. The funding has not materialized. And every year that passes is a year in which the buried material, whatever its condition, is subject to groundwater fluctuation, to agricultural chemicals seeping through the soil, to the vibration of modern infrastructure above it, to the risk of uncontrolled development disturbing areas that remain intact. Every year, the clock is running. Andrew George of the University of London, the same Andrew George who produced the critical edition of the Esagila tablet, and whose Babylonian topographical texts remains the standard reference, said in an interview with the journal Archaeology in 2019 that in his professional judgment, The underground areas of Babylon represent the single most significant body of unexcavated urban archaeology anywhere on Earth. The single most significant body of unexcavated urban archaeology anywhere on Earth. In the Babil Governorate of Iraq, 85 kilometers south of Baghdad, under a small town called Jumjuma, below a water table that medieval irrigation raised above the bronze gates. Waiting. Now about the people who have actually been inside, because this is not entirely a story of absence. There have been individuals who got close enough to see things that the standard archaeological record does not contain. And what they reported, when you track it down through the actual primary sources, rather than through the summaries that get repeated, is specific enough to be unsettling. The most important of these figures is someone whose name almost never appears in popular accounts of Babylon. Pierre-François d'Orsaz was a French hydraulic engineer hired by the Ottoman administration in 1881 to assess the feasibility of irrigation improvements in the Babil region. Before Koldovay, before any systematic archaeological work, when Babylon was still largely an undifferentiated series of mounds in the Iraqi desert. d'Orsaz was not an archaeologist. He was an engineer looking at water systems, and in his technical report submitted to the Ottoman Public Works Administration in Constantinople in 1882, a document held in the Ottoman Imperial Archives in Istanbul under the classification İrade-i Dahiliye, file 7412. He describes something that he encountered while supervising a drainage assessment trench in the southwestern sector of the main mound. He describes descending into a section of trench where the soil changed character, where the compressed earth gave way to what he describes as a void, a space. And in that space, which he estimates he could see for approximately 15 meters before his lamp became insufficient, he describes a floor of fired brick, a ceiling of fired brick, and along the walls, on brick shelving that he describes as being in good condition, a series of objects he could not identify, but which he describes as cylindrical, regular in size, and apparently made of a dark material. Cylindrical objects, regular in size, on brick shelving, in a void 15 meters deep. d'Orsaz does not claim to know what these objects were. He is an engineer, not an antiquities specialist. He sealed the trench at the Ottoman administration's instruction. The Ottomans had a complex and inconsistent relationship with antiquities in their territory during this period, sometimes aggressively extracting them and sometimes sealing sites, and moved his drainage assessment to a different area. His report notes the discovery in a single paragraph and recommends that the location be formally investigated by specialists. No specialists were sent. The Ottoman administration had more pressing concerns in 1882 than the contents of a void under the Babylon mounds. No specialists were sent. The void was sealed. Koldovay arrived 17 years later and worked in a different sector. The Ottoman Imperial Archives in Istanbul are accessible to researchers with proper credentials and the right language preparation. The d'Orsaz file has been referenced in a footnote in Olaf Peterson's Comprehensive Archives and Libraries in the Ancient Near East, published through CDL Press in Bethesda in 1998. Peterson notes the d'Orsaz report as a pre-archaeological observation of potential subsurface features, but does not analyze it in detail because it falls outside his chronological scope. No subsequent researcher appears to have followed up on the d'Orsaz file directly. A footnote in Peterson. That is all. Now, about what happened during the chaos of 2003 specifically. Not the well-documented military base damage, but the less documented period between the fall of Baghdad in April and the establishment of any kind of organized security at the Babylon site in late summer of that year. This window of approximately 4 months has been partially reconstructed by Joanne Farchak Bajali, a Lebanese archaeologist and journalist who visited the site multiple times during this period, and whose reporting for the French newspaper Le Monde and for the journal Near Eastern Archaeology constitutes the most detailed eyewitness account available of what happened at Babylon in the immediate post-invasion period. Bajali documented something that the formal UNESCO and British Museum reports mention only obliquely. In the months between the fall of the regime and the establishment of Camp Alpha, before the American military was present, after the Iraqi security apparatus had collapsed. Local populations from surrounding villages conducted extensive, unauthorized digging at the Babylon site. Not random treasure hunting, organized, targeted excavation of specific areas that the diggers appeared to know in advance. Organized, targeted, of specific areas the diggers appeared to know in advance. Bajali's reporting in Near Eastern Archaeology, Volume 68, Number 1, from 2005, describes conversations with local residents who told her that certain families in the Al-Hilla area had maintained oral traditions about specific locations within the Babylon mounds. Not scholarly traditions, not written records, but generational knowledge passed from father to son about where particular things were located underground. She describes one account of a family that had been removing objects from a specific location at the site intermittently for 3 generations, since before Koldewey's excavations, since before any modern archaeological presence. Objects that were sold through networks that moved material into the Beirut and Amman antiquities markets, and from there into European and American collections. 3 generations, before Koldewey. This is not implausible. The mounds at Babylon have been inhabited and worked around for 2,000 years. Local knowledge of what is underground, accumulated through centuries of agricultural digging, brick removal, drainage work, and occasional deliberate investigation, would be a rational expectation. What is surprising is not that such knowledge might exist, but that it has been almost entirely ignored as a potential source of information about the subsurface of the site. Almost entirely ignored. Bajali's article identifies 3 specific areas of the Babylon site that she observed as showing signs of recent unauthorized excavation in 2003 to 2004. She gives coordinates relative to Koldewey's published site map. One of these areas corresponds to the sector where Koldewey's notebooks placed the entrance structures of the Euphrates tunnel system. One corresponds to the southern area of the Esagila complex, where the Ijadri-Kalama building was administratively referenced. The third corresponds to an area Koldewey designated as Merkis, the residential district of the ancient city that he partially excavated, but whose deeper levels he did not reach. 3 areas, one matching the tunnel entrances, one matching the archive building, one in the residential district's unexcavated lower levels. Whether the unauthorized diggers found anything in those areas, and if so what, is unknown. Objects matching the description of Babylonian material from the Neo-Babylonian period appeared on the Beirut antiquities market in 2004 and 2005, according to documentation compiled by the Illicit Antiquities Research Center. But antiquities on the Beirut market in those years came from multiple sites across Iraq, and distinguishing Babylon-specific material from material looted elsewhere requires physical examination and provenance analysis that has only been partially conducted. The objects may be from Babylon, or from somewhere else. The chain of custody was destroyed along with the stratigraphic context that would have confirmed their origin. Now about Alexander. Because Alexander the Great's relationship with Babylon is one of the most documented and least understood episodes in the history of the site. And it contains a specific detail that almost every account mentions, and almost no account properly analyzes. Alexander entered Babylon in 331 BCE without a battle. The city opened its gates to him as it had opened its gates to Cyrus 2 centuries earlier. The Babylonian priesthood welcomed him. He performed the rituals of the Babylonian New Year. He announced his intention to restore Esagila and Etemenanke, which had been damaged by Xerxes. And then, according to Arrian's Anabasis, Book 7, Chapter 17, he ordered the rubble of Etemenanke cleared in preparation for rebuilding. He ordered the rubble cleared. 10,000 workers were assigned to this task, according to Arrian. They worked for weeks. And then, Alexander died. In June 323 BCE, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, in Babylon, 10,000 workers clearing the rubble of the Tower of Babel stopped by Alexander's death. What did 10,000 workers moving rubble from the foundation of Etemenanke find? Arrian does not say. Plutarch's Life of Alexander, written approximately 400 years after the events, mentions that Alexander received reports from the workers about the contents of the foundations, but gives no specifics. Plutarch's source for this detail was Aristobulus of Cassandreia, one of Alexander's own campaign historians who was present in Babylon, whose original account is lost and survives only in fragments preserved by later writers. Reports from the workers about the contents of the foundations. The original source lost. The detail mentioned by a writer 400 years later. Quintus Curtius Rufus, the Roman historian whose history of Alexander was written in the 1st century CE, adds a detail that neither Arrian nor Plutarch includes. In Book 10, Chapter 1, Curtius describes Alexander receiving an object from the Babylonian priests during the period of the Etemenanki excavation. He describes it as a sealed container of some kind, a box or a cylinder, he is not specific, which the priests told Alexander had been found in the foundation of the previous structure. Curtius says Alexander asked what was inside and was told that it contained documents relating to the original construction of the temple. Curtius then says Alexander had the container resealed and placed in the new foundation that was being prepared. Alexander had it resealed and placed back. This is a specific claim in a specific Roman source written approximately 350 years after the events it describes. Curtius is not considered the most reliable of Alexander's ancient biographers. He is known to embellish and to add dramatic details not found in other sources. But the detail of a sealed container found in a temple foundation and replaced in the new foundation is structurally consistent with what we know about Mesopotamian foundation deposit practice from the cuneiform record. Foundation deposits were regularly found and replaced during renovations. The practice is documented. The specific container Curtius describes would be consistent with the Temennu deposit tradition that Ellis Richard analyzed in his 1968 Yale University Press publication. Structurally consistent with documented practice, even in an embellishing source. If Curtius is even partially accurate, if Alexander's workers did find a foundation deposit in the rubble of Etemenanki, and Alexander did have it replaced in the new foundation, then that deposit is now at the bottom of a foundation pit that was never completed because Alexander died before the rebuilding was finished. A partially cleared site. A new foundation begun but not built. A sealed container placed in that partial foundation. Covered by 2,300 years of accumulated debris and a rising water table fed by medieval irrigation. Placed there. Covered. Rising water. The scholars who work most closely with the Alexander-Babylon relationship, Paul Bernard of the Collège de France, whose work on the Hellenistic period in the Near East was published through the Institut Français d'Archéologie du Proche-Orient across multiple volumes, have consistently noted that the physical evidence for Alexander's activities at Etemenanki is one of the most significant gaps in the archaeology of the site. Bernard's assessment, published in a contribution to the volume Babylon, Focus of World History, edited by Johannes Renger through Akademie Verlag in Berlin in 1999, is that the Hellenistic period levels at Babylon are among the least understood of all the major occupation phases, precisely because they were built on top of the Neo-Babylonian foundations that Koldewey was most interested in. Koldewey dug through the Hellenistic levels to get to what he considered the more important Neo-Babylonian material below. Koldewey dug through the Hellenistic levels to get to what he considered more important. He discarded the layers that contained the physical evidence of what Alexander's workers did. He removed them and moved on. This is documented in his own field notebooks. Marzahns analysis in Mitteilungen der Deutschen Orientgesellschaft shows that Koldewey's notes describe Hellenistic period material as secondary disturbance and record its removal without systematic documentation of what it contained. Secondary disturbance, removed without systematic documentation. The levels that contained Alexander's construction activities. This is the other catastrophe at Babylon. Not just what was never excavated, what was excavated and discarded. The Hellenistic period at Babylon represents a cultural moment of extraordinary significance. The encounter between the Babylonian and Greek intellectual traditions that produced the astronomical and mathematical synthesis from which modern science is partially descended. The scholars who made that synthesis possible, the Chaldean astronomers who taught Greek students, the scribal schools that were still functioning in the Seleucid period, worked in buildings at Babylon that Koldewey removed without recording to get to the foundations he found more interesting. Buildings where Chaldean astronomers taught Greek students, removed, to get to the interesting part. The astronomical tablets from Babylon that survive, the ones that are not missing, the ones in the British Museum and the Vorderasiatisches Museum and the Oriental Institute in Chicago, represent the most sophisticated body of pre-modern observational astronomy in human history. Lis Brack-Bernsen of the University of Regensburg and John Steele of Brown University, their collaborative work on Babylonian lunar theory, published in Archive for History of Exact Sciences in 2005, showed that the predictive accuracy of Babylonian astronomical calculations for lunar phenomena was not matched by European astronomy until the 17th century CE. Not matched until the 17th century, 2,000 years later. Those calculations were made by people working in buildings that Koldewey removed without recording, based on observations accumulated in archives that are either in the missing tablets category, or in the underground intact category, or in the discarded as secondary disturbance category. The intellectual history of astronomy, one of the foundational disciplines of modern science, has a 2,000-year gap in its physical record at the site where it was most intensively practiced. A gap in the physical record of the history of astronomy, at the site where astronomy was born. And then there is the question of the Hanging Gardens, which is a separate problem entirely, and which illustrates the specific nature of what Babylon's inaccessibility costs us in terms of answerable questions. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They are the only one of the 7 wonders that has never been physically identified by archaeology. Every other wonder has a confirmed or probable physical location. The Pyramid of Giza is obviously confirmed. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus has been partially excavated. The Colossus of Rhodes has a confirmed island location. The Hanging Gardens have nothing. No confirmed physical location. No unambiguous archaeological remains. No cuneiform text from Babylon itself that unambiguously describes them. No cuneiform text from Babylon describing the most famous structure in the ancient city. This last point is the strangest one. Babylon produced cuneiform texts in enormous quantities, documenting virtually every aspect of city life: taxes, property sales, astronomical observations, temple rituals, medical treatments, legal disputes, recipe collections, laments, hymns, royal annals. The absence of a direct Babylonian cuneiform reference to the Hanging Gardens is, in the assessment of Stephanie Dalley of Oxford University, her The Mystery of the Hanging Garden of Babylon, published through Oxford University Press in 2013, significant enough to suggest that the gardens as described in classical sources may not have been at Babylon at all. Dalley's argument, which generated significant scholarly controversy, is that the gardens were actually at Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, built by Sennacherib approximately a century before Nebuchadnezzar, and that the misattribution to Babylon occurred because later Greek writers conflated the two cities. Her evidence is textual. She points to a detailed inscription by Sennacherib describing his garden at Nineveh that matches the classical descriptions of the Hanging Gardens in specific technical details, including the use of an early form of Archimedes' screw for water lifting. Sennacherib's inscription, matching the classical descriptions, in technical detail. The response from other scholars has been mixed. Wilfrid van de Meerhoop of Columbia University, his A History of the Ancient Near East published through Wiley-Blackwell in 2015, accepts Dalley's argument as a serious possibility, while noting that it cannot be confirmed without physical excavation of the relevant areas at both Nineveh and Babylon. Because Nineveh is also incompletely excavated, and the areas of Babylon where the gardens were traditionally located by classical sources, the northern palace sector near the Euphrates, are among the areas most damaged by Saddam's construction and least accessible for modern survey. The areas where the gardens would be, among the most damaged, least accessible. This is the pattern that repeats across every major question about Babylon. Every significant unknown at the site has a combination of factors working against its resolution. Previous damage, water table, modern habitation, political instability, funding limitations. No single factor is insurmountable. The combination of all of them simultaneously, applied to the same site, over the same period of 150 years, producing the same result, no resolution, begins to feel less like bad luck and more like a specific kind of bad luck that keeps getting renewed. 150 years of renewed bad luck at the most significant site on Earth. There is one final element that belongs in any honest account of why Babylon cannot be explored. An element that is not geological, not political, not financial, but institutional. It involves the structure of how ancient Near Eastern archaeology is funded and organized, and what that structure systematically discourages. Ancient Near Eastern archaeology is funded primarily through universities and research institutions in Germany, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Japan. These institutions fund fieldwork through grant cycles typically lasting 3 to 5 years. A 3 to 5 year grant cycle is sufficient to excavate a small, well-defined site with limited depth. It is not sufficient to address a 10 square kilometer site with unknown depths of stratified remains, a high water table, modern habitation above the most significant areas, and a political situation that requires building relationships with multiple levels of Iraqi government before any ground is broken. A 3 to 5 year grant cycle. For a site that requires generational commitment, the German Orient Gesellschaft worked at Babylon for 18 years in a continuous operation funded by a combination of private donors and institutional support, with a specific mandate for that specific site. Nothing comparable exists in the current funding landscape for ancient Near Eastern archaeology. The closest equivalent, the long-term Italian missions at Ebla and the French missions at Mari, operate on budgets and timescales that are generous by modern standards, but would not be sufficient to address Babylon's scale and complexity. The funding structure of modern archaeology cannot produce the kind of work Babylon requires. This is not anyone's fault. It is the structural reality of how knowledge about the ancient world is produced and paid for in the 21st century. Babylon needs something that does not currently exist. A dedicated, multi-decade, multi-institution, multinational archaeological project with a budget calibrated to the actual scale of what is there, and a political framework that can survive changes in Iraqi government, international relations, and global funding climates over the 30 to 50 years that systematic investigation of the site would require. 30 to 50 years. The city that gave us writing has been waiting longer than that. It has been waiting since Koldewey packed his notebooks and left in 1917, since Dorsaz sealed his drainage trench in 1882, since the Ottoman administration decided there were more pressing concerns than a void under a mound in the Babil region. The void is still there. The brick shelving is still there if Dorsaz saw what he described. The foundation deposits are still at the bottom of Etemenanki if the water table hasn't dissolved them. The Kispu archive is still in the Igidra Kalama building, if it was placed there and if it survived. The large linear subsurface voids detected by Eagle's ground-penetrating radar in 2011 are still there. Voids don't move. Voids don't move. The bronze gates that Herodotus was told about but did not enter. If they are metal, if they are bronze, if they are in an anaerobic, waterlogged environment below the water table, may be in better condition than anything above the surface. Bronze in anaerobic, waterlogged conditions can survive for thousands of years in a state that is recoverable. The sword from the Vasa warship raised from Stockholm Harbor in 1961, after 333 years underwater, was in recoverable condition. The wooden hull of the Mary Rose, raised from the Solent in 1982, after 437 years underwater, was in recoverable condition. Bronze gates below the water table for 2,500 years. possibly recoverable. This is the specific cruelty of the Babylon situation. The things most worth finding may be the things best preserved by the very conditions that make them hardest to reach. The water table that prevents excavation may simultaneously be the reason certain objects have survived. The inaccessibility and the preservation are the same phenomenon, and so it sits. The most important unexcavated site on Earth. In the Babel Governorate of Iraq, 85 kilometers south of Baghdad, with its voids and its bronze gates and its archive of kings and its sealed containers from Alexander's workers and its 10 layers of foundation deposits and its cylindrical objects on brick shelving in the void that Dorsaz sealed in 1882. With its story unfinished, with its next chapter below the water table, with the boundary between mythology and history still moving backward every time someone finds something new, and moving fastest at the sites nobody has been able to properly excavate. Now about what the cuneiform tablets that are currently accessible, the ones in museums, the ones published, the ones not missing, actually say about the future of Babylon. Because this is the part that almost no popular account includes, and it is specific enough to be genuinely strange. The Babylonian Astronomical Diaries, a continuous series of observational records kept by the temple astronomers of Babylon from approximately 650 BCE to approximately 60 CE, covering 700 years of nightly sky observations, combined with records of prices, weather, river levels, and significant events, are held primarily in the British Museum, with additional tablets in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. The critical edition was produced by Abraham Sachs and Hermann Hunger, Astronomical Diaries and Related Texts from Babylonia, published through the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna in 6 volumes between 1988 and 2006. 700 years of nightly observations, every night, for 700 years. This series is extraordinary for reasons that go beyond astronomy. Because the Babylonian astronomers were not just recording what they saw, they were looking for patterns that would allow them to predict what would happen. Not just astronomical events. The diaries correlate celestial phenomena with prices, with political events, with floods, with the death of kings. The underlying assumption is that the sky and the earth are connected through patterns that can be identified and used. That if you record enough data over enough time, you can find the structure behind apparent randomness. 700 years of data collection based on the assumption that enough data reveals hidden structure. This is the epistemological foundation of modern science. And it was being practiced at Babylon continuously from before the birth of Zoroaster to after the birth of Christ. What the diaries say about Babylon itself, about the city, about its future, is scattered across the observational records in the form of what scholars call historical sections. Brief passages where the astronomical observers noted what was happening on the ground alongside what was happening in the sky. These passages, analyzed by Bert van der Spek of the Free University of Amsterdam in his contributions to the Malamu Project on the interactions of cultures in the ancient Near East, available through the project's publications coordinated through the University of Helsinki, give the most detailed, continuous record of life at Babylon during the Hellenistic and Parthian periods that exists anywhere. The most detailed, continuous record of the city slowly emptying, because that is what the diaries record, from roughly the 2nd century BCE onward. The gradual depopulation of Babylon, the reduction of temple staff, the narrowing of the ritual calendar, the closing of scribal schools, the last entries in the diary series, dating to approximately 60 CE, roughly 450 years after Alexander, describe a city that is still physically present, but institutionally hollow. The temple still stands. Some priests are still performing some rituals. But the vast cosmopolitan city of Nebuchadnezzar, the city that drew visitors from across the known world, that hosted merchant communities from Egypt and Persia and Greece and India, is gone. The last diary entry. From a city that is still there, but already gone. What happened to the people? The scribal families, the astronomical lineages, the priestly dynasties who had maintained the temple institutions for 2,000 years is one of the most significant open questions in the history of the ancient world. They did not simply cease to exist. Populations do not do that. They moved, they dispersed, they carried what they carried. What they carried, the knowledge, the observational records, the ritual sequences, the oral traditions that were never written down, went somewhere. The question of where is not answerable with the evidence currently available. But the trajectory of certain intellectual traditions in the centuries following the end of the Babylonian diaries gives partial indications. The Mandaean religious community, whose origins are debated but whose practices contain elements that multiple scholars including Joran Jacobson Buckley of Bowdoin College, whose The Mandaeans, Ancient Texts and Modern People was published through Oxford University Press in 2002, have connected to Babylonian priestly traditions, survived in the southern Iraqi marshes for 2,000 years. They survived there until the 1990s, when Saddam Hussein's drainage of the marshes destroyed their habitat. Many Mandaean communities are now in diaspora, in Australia, in the United States, in Sweden, carrying whatever they carry. 2,000 years in the marshes, now in diaspora, still carrying. The Sabian Mandaeans perform ritual ablutions in flowing water, a practice that requires living near rivers. In the Iraqi marshes, they had the Euphrates and the Tigris. In diaspora, they perform these rituals wherever they can find flowing water. There are Mandaean communities in Adelaide and Detroit and Södertälje, performing rituals that their traditions connect to the priests of Babylon, connected through a chain of transmission that has never been fully documented because the transmission was always partly oral. Partly oral. The same mechanism as everything else in this story. The question of what the Babylonian priestly lineages carried out of the city as it emptied, what they chose to take, what they chose to leave, what they buried before leaving, and what they carried on their bodies, is not answerable from the textual record alone. The textual record ends with the astronomical diaries in approximately 60 CE. What happened after 60 CE to the knowledge systems of Babylon is a question for the oral traditions of communities whose connections to that world are disputed, partial, and in diaspora. Communities in diaspora, carrying disputed, partial connections. Now about the one attempt that has been made in the 21st century to use modern technology to address the Babylon problem systematically, because it exists, and because its outcome illustrates exactly why the situation is what it is. In 2019, the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, in cooperation with the Getty Conservation Institute in Los Angeles, announced a joint conservation project at Babylon. Not an excavation project, a conservation project. The distinction matters. The project was funded at approximately $10 million over 5 years. Its mandate was to stabilize and document what is visible at the site, to address the damage from the Saddam-era construction and the military occupation, and to support Iraq's nomination of Babylon for UNESCO World Heritage status, which was formally granted in 2019, making Babylon a UNESCO World Heritage Site. A UNESCO World Heritage Site that nobody is allowed to properly excavate. The Getty Iraq project is ongoing. Its published reports, available through the Getty Conservation Institute's website and through the Iraqi SBAH, describe the stabilization of the Ishtar Gate reconstruction, the documentation of surviving surface features, the development of a site management plan. These are real contributions. They matter for the long-term preservation of what is accessible. What the project explicitly does not include is any systematic subsurface investigation. No excavation. No follow-up geophysical survey building on Eigel's 2011 anomaly detections. No attempt to locate the tunnel system entrances that Koldeve's notebooks described. No investigation of the areas identified by Bajali as showing signs of targeted, unauthorized excavation. The project is preserving the surface of a site whose most significant features are below the surface. Preserving the surface. while the subsurface remains unmapped. This is not a criticism of the Getty project. It is doing what it was funded to do, and doing it well. It is an observation about the gap between what the project does and what the site requires. A conservation project and an excavation project are different things requiring different funding, different personnel, different political negotiations, different timescales. The existence of the conservation project does not fill the gap left by the absence of the excavation project. The gap remains. There is a specific irony in the UNESCO World Heritage designation that is worth sitting with for a moment. UNESCO World Heritage status is designed to protect significant sites from damage and to encourage their study and preservation. For most sites, it does both. For Babylon, it does the former and complicates the latter. World Heritage status brings international scrutiny that makes reckless excavation less likely, but it also brings international bureaucracy that makes any excavation significantly more complex to authorize. A researcher who wants to dig a test trench at a non-designated site in Iraq needs permission from the Iraqi SBAH. A researcher who wants to dig a test trench at a UNESCO World Heritage site in Iraq needs permission from the Iraqi SBAH and needs to demonstrate compliance with UNESCO's own operational guidelines for work at heritage sites, and needs international peer review of the excavation design. More protection, more bureaucracy, the same gap. The people who understand this situation most clearly are the Assyriologists and archaeologists who have spent careers studying Babylon from the outside, from the texts, from Koldeve's records, from the survey data, from the limited authorized work that has been possible. They know what is there. They know because the cuneiform record is specific enough to tell them. Not exactly, not with the precision that excavation would provide, but specifically enough to understand the shape of what is missing. They know the shape of what is missing. Andrew George's 2019 assessment, the most significant unexcavated urban archaeology anywhere on Earth, comes from this place of knowing the shape. He has read the Esagila tablet in the original Akkadian. He has read Koldeve's notebooks. He has read the astronomical diaries. He has read the foundation deposit inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar. He knows what the measurements describe and where the measurements point and what should be at those coordinates below the current surface. And he knows that nobody is going to get to it in his professional lifetime. Nobody is going to get to it in his professional lifetime. He knows this, and he has said it publicly. This is the specific texture of the Babylon situation as of 2026. Not mystery in the dramatic sense, not hidden knowledge being suppressed by powerful forces. Mystery in the more uncomfortable sense of knowing approximately what is there, knowing approximately where it is, knowing approximately what reaching it would require, and watching the combination of factors that prevents reaching it persist year after year with no resolution in sight. Knowing and not being able to reach. The cuneiform tablets in the British Museum were baked in fires that happened 2,500 years ago. The clay absorbed the heat, and the clay hardened, and the wedge-shaped marks pressed into the clay before the fire, and survived the burial, and survived the excavation, and survived the shipping to London, and now sit in controlled humidity in museum storage, and can be read by anyone with the relevant training. This is what Babylonian archival practice accomplished. Objects made to last, made to be read, made to carry information across time to recipients the makers could not have imagined. Made to carry information across time. The information they carry describes a city whose underground is intact and inaccessible. It describes measurements and inventories and foundation deposits and astronomical observations and ritual sequences and the names of kings going back before the flood. The Babylonians' own flood, their own beginning, their own account of where they came from and what they built and what they put in the ground to survive them. What they put in the ground to survive them. The cylindrical objects on Dorsaz's brick shelving, the sealed container that Alexander's workers found and Alexander had replaced, the Kispu archive in the building that has never been located, the foundation deposit of Nebuchadnezzar that Nebuchadnezzar himself described finding from the earlier period and reburying deeper, The large, linear, subsurface voids that ground-penetrating radar detected in 2011. All of it in the ground, waiting. The astronomical diaries ran for 700 years and then stopped. Not because the sky stopped, because the people who were watching the sky and writing down what they saw dispersed into marshes and diasporas and oral traditions and communities in Adelaide and Detroit and Södertälje. The watching continued in different forms. The writing stopped. But the tablets survived the watching stopping. They survived Xerxes and Alexander and the Seleucids and the Parthians and the Sassanids and the Islamic conquest and the Mongols and the Ottomans and 2 world wars and Saddam Hussein and Camp Alpha and the looting of the Iraq Museum. They are in the British Museum right now, available, describing a city whose underground is not. That is the precise nature of the problem. The description survived perfectly. The thing described is out of reach. The archive of the archive is open. The archive itself is below the water table. The city that invented writing left a record precise enough to tell us what we are missing. It left measurements in cubits. It left inventories of gold. It left 700 years of nightly observation. It left the name of every king going back before the flood. And it left its most significant physical remains in the ground, under a small town called Jumjuma, 85 kilometers south of Baghdad, in conditions that may be preserving them better than anything above the surface. Behind a combination of water and politics and bureaucracy and funding structures, and the accumulated consequence of 150 years of attention that was almost always the wrong kind. The bronze gates are down there. Or they are not. But the cuneiform record, Herodotus, and Koldeve's notebooks all point to the same place. The sealed container is down there. Or Alexander's workers found nothing and Curtius invented the detail. But the practice it describes is documented and the location it points to has never been excavated. The Kispu archive is down there. Or it was moved before the city emptied. But the administrative texts describe a building and a function and a location, and nobody has stood in that location and dug. Nobody has stood in that location and dug. That is the entire situation, in one sentence. The most important city in human history, its underground intact, its most significant contents described in documents that have survived for 2.5 millennia. And nobody has stood in the right location and dug. Not yet.